Good morning, everyone. Let me get my mic turned on here. I'll do that again. Good morning, everyone. Before we get into Genesis chapter 2, I want to go back to Genesis chapter 1 for just a little bit and just read to you from verse 31 where God saw all that he had made, and it was good. My NIV here says it was very good. Now, I want to divide you all right down the middle right here, and I'd like to have this group take a good look at that group over there. Now, let's see if we can pay them a nice compliment. That God saw all that God had made, and God said, Now, can you be a little more convincing of that side? Dell's on board. So God looked over there and saw all that God had made, and God said, would you like to have one more chance? So God looked over there and saw all that God had made and said, it's very, very good. Now, I understand there's a fair amount of people who watch this or may watch it later on a DVD or maybe through the web. Can we have God look at all of them? And God saw them, and God said that is very good, all of you who aren't able to be here in the building this morning. So, do you believe that? That everything that God had made, that it was really good? This was what God had intended and hoped for. And now I want to move into Genesis chapter 2, where we have another creation account. I grew up in the church, and I know this is a little bit like Review of Biblit, again, Michelle, but it's like I never really thought that there is a second creation account, but there really is. So that is what we heard this morning, and it's a very different creation account because in Genesis 1, we have God creating just by God's spoken word, like, let there be light, and it just happened. And there was light. In Genesis 2, this account that we heard this morning is really different than that. I mean, I have to think of my granddaughter. When we were at Hilton Head, we got a chance to spend some time with her and my daughter and son-in-law in Hilton Head, and the way that she liked to build things with the sand, the way she would scrape it together, and we would try to build sand castles or something that resembled it. And, have you ever seen kids try to make, like, a human form of some sort, or they'll bury themselves in the sand with just their head sticking out, but then try to make their body. I mean, that's kind of the image of God coming down to the dirt and the dust and pulling this together, forming it and shaping it into a man, and then this intimate language of breathing into his nostrils, and that then he became a living soul. That's getting pretty intimate when we can feel air movement from somebody else next to us, the breath into our nostrils, the breath of life. And then God also created all of these other different animals. I mean, it just sounds like a lot of fun to be able to, shape together whatever it's going to be, a giraffe, and just touch it, put the breath of life into it, and off it goes. And see what Adam is going to do with it. Adam was given the task of naming all of the animals and being caretaker. But yet there was still something missing. He still was not able to find a suitable helper for him. Now that's quite a word. Depending on what we do with that word helper, that influences the way we see the rest of Scripture. And it's something that could be talked about for another time. But that word helper is almost exclusively used to describe God. From the psalm, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? It's the same word. So I think It's difficult for me to say in any way that the woman in this story is somehow subservient to the man. And God did not go down on the ground and form this woman. He went to Adam's side and took his very flesh. As Adam says later, this is flesh of my flesh. This is DNA of my DNA. This is finally somebody that I can relate to. And perhaps we could say the help that Eve brought was that she rescued Adam from his aloneness. He finally had someone to be in communion with. Not just physically, but in all of life, someone to share his life with, to share the garden with. Going back to Genesis 1, it's really clear there that God intended to create humankind in God's image. It took me kind of a long time to put this together. I'm kind of ashamed to say how long. I used to just think that as long as we have a male and female present, that's the image of God. When I, as a pastor, would look at the congregational information forms, I would look sometimes and see their elder or deacon group, how many male, how many female, because I just began to appreciate so much that we need both perspectives in leadership. But I was still kind of stuck on that if you have the male and you have the female, you've somehow got the image of God. Now, this is a sobering way to say this, but in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and it was called the Tree of Life Synagogue. I heard that on the way to church this morning and just haven't been able to get that out of my mind. There were male and female people there, I'm sure. Was the image of God present there? Probably was in some ways. But my whole point is that it is not just about the presence of a man and a woman. It's about what happens here. It's how we relate to each other. And part of what I want to get back to in sort of this getting reoriented to what does it mean to be the church is just to remind us that the early church grew so much because people were absolutely fascinated by what they saw. I mean, can you imagine an outreach program like that? That's part of your branding, that people are fascinated by you. There's just something they don't see anywhere else, and it doesn't make any sense to them. You've got a Democrat and a Republican sitting right at the same table, talking to each other. They're sharing pictures of their kids and grandkids. And that used to happen. But it doesn't happen as much in our society anymore. We were created in the image of God, and I believe we reflect that image of God in the way that we relate to each other. That is where you see it. That is what fascinates people, and that is what draws them in. And it was there in the beginning, in the garden. But it didn't take us long to have that start to fall apart. And a lot of times, it's just because we think we're right. There's no reason that we shouldn't be able to eat from that tree. I mean, yeah, the serpent planted the idea, but inside it's that wonder, that curiosity, and I've got to find out, and surely life is going to be better if it's like that, if we have eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then things start getting messy. They lose their communion with God, but God still reaches out to them. They don't die right away. Continues to be in relationship with them. But it opened up that door, that each of us have that door to make the choice about Will we follow Jesus, or will we just do what is right in our own mind, especially when I think that I'm right and you're wrong? And to be willing to pay a high price for it. Cain let his jealousy and anger get out of hand, and he took Abel's life. The whole world became so evil in the next couple chapters that God regretted even creating humankind, destroyed the earth with a flood, but saved a family. But even the descendants of Noah continued to have their issues. And you go all the way down to like Jacob and Esau. And you have that story of Jacob taking Esau's birthright by trickery. You're created with gifts of creativity, but sometimes we use those gifts to get what we think is best or what's coming to us. And it continues down the family line. Joseph and his brothers sell him into slavery, even fake his death, and cause untold heartache. The response that they had in their family was much worse than what they had anticipated. But what really kind of amazes me in just thinking about Pastor Clayton's prayer today, different things going on in our society, looking at Scripture, is that at least Scripture is honest about where we've been. This morning we're going to do a lament for the doctrine of discovery. You know, it's basically that if you discover a new land, you can subjugate the people that live there, and it was your duty to bring them to the Christian faith. And a lot of harms happened over that because they really weren't seen as people created in the image of God. I have been around as a transition pastor, interim pastor, quite a bit, and I want to show you a picture, be up on the PowerPoint, of living in Minneapolis. If you can make that out up there, there is I'm not sure which side that's on. It's on the right-hand side of that blue line is where Luann and I lived. We're about a mile south of the downtown. But I was very close to the Greenway, so I would ride my bicycle there over to Lake Calhoun. And then from Lake Calhoun, there's a chain of lakes that, I could go for 12 miles just around to Lake Calhoun, Lake Harriet, and back again. It was just a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. And I have a picture to show you why. Some of the scenes of the sunsets were just gorgeous on Lake Calhoun. Now, that lake is busier than this picture would let on. But one of the things that I appreciated so much about Minneapolis is they did not allow people to build right up to the lake. Didn't matter how much money you had. You couldn't buy property on that lake. They kept the banks of the lake, and I forget the distance. I mean, this was in the late 1800s and the early 1900s when they were doing this planning. They wanted these lakes to be for everyone. Now, doesn't that sound kind of like an Anabaptist value? There's a lake right next to this one that's called Lake of the Isles that has homes that are valued anywhere from $1.5 million to $2 million. But they can't own right up to the lake. So you get to go around there, and they've embraced that. There's one house we would go by that had 2 cement chairs. I mean, they're very nice stone chairs, like with a stone table that had a chess set on it. So you wanted to take a break from your walk, you could just slip in to their little table and play chess for a while if you wanted to. But there is that sense of community there. Now, when I was looking this up, I was just kind of surprised by what I found, because one of the unique things about Minneapolis is that it is the only city that has a tribal nation, Native American nation, right within its city limits. It was only about 4 blocks from where we lived. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about this lake, because it was out of that I discovered Lake Calhoun has had its name changed Because I just wanted to show you a picture of it. I typed in Lake Calhoun, and yeah, that it'll list all these things that are Lake Calhoun. But then as soon as you do your search and you see the actual lake, they have changed the name to B'day Makaska, which is the native Dakota language name for that lake. So as much as I appreciated sharing that lake with all of mostly other white people around Lake Calhoun, it wasn't ours to begin with, really. The Dakota were pushed off of it so that we could share it among the white settlers. And I was just really moved by that, and to hear one of the Dakota people who teaches at the University of Minnesota, and just how he said when he sees that name, he said, I finally feel like I am welcome here. We all can belong here. We're going to move into a time of lamenting this doctrine of discovery. I invite the music team to come up, and those who are going to be reading. You know, we started this morning with a very upbeat call to worship that I just really like. We've moved into a scripture passage that I just so want to embrace, that intimacy that we have with God. And now we're going to move into a lament that is hard to hear. As we read first-person voices of those who have been deeply affected by this doctrine of discovery, the first peoples of North America, and some from, there's one person who is representing South America. What you see on the screen is a quilt that was, sorry about that. This was designed by Gina Adams. It's called a broken treaty quilt. And her idea for this was to take language from the different treaties that were broken, to piece them together in a quilt, but to do it in a way to show that we as a people had been a woven pattern of tapestry. That was their view of life as these native indigenous peoples. But the quilt is to represent how tattered that quilt has become, how it began to tear. And what does it mean to be able to put it back together again? When we get toward the end of this reading, there's going to be a poem that's called the Eagle Poem. That's going to be read by Caroline and Rihanna, and they won't come up you'll come up at the very end there to read that, which will begin to help us think about, well, what's next as a people? Where is the hope after we hear these stories? So here as we read together.
The U.S. has made over 500 nation-to-nation treaties with tribal nations. All of them have been broken, changed, or nullified. We dwell in a land of broken covenants, and so we lament. We live on land gained by injustice.
Our peoplehood concept and our tribally oriented thinking looks upon individual ownership of land as an alien concept. This concept has also been rejected and is being resisted most by reserve or reservation Indian tribes. A reserve or a reservation is their land, to be sure. It may be owned, but it is owned by the entire tribe. One of the major articles in peace treaties is that a reserve or a reservation is to be held by the tribe in perpetuity. There are strong outside forces at work today to break up these reserves and reservations. Lawrence Hart.
See this? All around this cantonment is all white man land now. There's no Indian settlement here, no trees, all wheat, all level. See how they cheated us? They didn't just cheat, they stole. They stole it. They stole a lot of Cheyenne and Arapaho lands, and they call us poor things. Poor things. Sure, they made us poor. Let us have some more land. Then we won't be so poor. Bertha Little Coyote.
I am a Northern Cheyenne woman who grew up on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation attending the White River Cheyenne Mennonite Church. I grew up with strong people. I grew up knowing my tribal nation survived years of attempted genocide by the U.S. government. I knew we had to fight for our homelands, and even though we live on them, we are legally only allowed the right of occupancy. We are not landowners. I was also keenly aware of the dangers to me specifically as an Indigenous woman. I knew that Native American women like Anna Mae Aquash went missing and were murdered, especially for speaking out. Erica Littlewolf.
Creator God, you have joined yourself with us in covenant. You are steadfast and faithful in your word to us. We confess that our Anabaptist churches have not been faithful in covenants with the first peoples of this land. We confess that out of hunger for cheap land, our faith ancestors went along with theologies and laws that allowed settlers to take land unjustly from Indigenous peoples who loved and tended the land. We confess that our churches did not raise their voices for justice for Indigenous peoples. And we confess that descendants of Anabaptist settlers have benefited from broken covenants and stolen land.
Out of the depths we cry out to you, O Lord. Hear our voice. We are deep under the weight of sin that piles up generation upon generation. Pressed into the ground, we wait for the Lord. Our souls wait, and in God's word we hope. Our souls wait for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning.
Cultural assimilation of indigenous peoples into dominant white society in the U.S. was part of federal Indian policy in the 19th and 20th centuries, with disastrous effects on Native communities. Mennonite Church mission played a complicated role that often accompanied government efforts to civilize Native Americans through Christianity. While there were efforts to learn and preserve indigenous languages, Mennonite denominations ran 3 Indian boarding schools that separated children from their families.
Oppression is a process, and as such, it has a beginning. The beginning is often physical in nature. Historically, oppression usually begins when peoples are invaded, uprooted, absorbed, or transported from their homeland. For example, Euro-American oppression of North America Indians really began in 1492. My generation is still feeling the vibrations from all of this. Oppression recycles itself from generation to generation. Emma LaRocque.
In most indigenous communities, the effects of genocide, dispossession, forced removal from homelands and families, intergenerational trauma, and racism have manifested in poverty, alcohol and drug problems, violence, and other forms of social breakdown. Harley Eagle.
My 2 brothers and I went to Intermountain Boarding School in Brigham City, Utah. And for 2 years I went. I remember it was 1956, and I was maybe 10 or 11. And that was very devastating. I had my brothers there, but my brothers were in different dorms. I know I was lonely. I missed my mother, Priscilla Wero.
Somewhere in my young years, I became convinced that I wouldn't live to be old. Erica Littlewolf.
Mothering God, you see and know every child ripped from the loving arms of parents and put into schools. You see and know every generation living under the shadow of trauma and oppression. We confess that our Anabaptist churches have been complicit in this system of assimilation that did not see the image of God in indigenous peoples. We confess that our churches have tried to remake indigenous children in the image of a white Savior. We lament that our churches have contributed to harms done to the vulnerable.
Out of the depths we cry out to you, O Lord. Lord, hear our voice. We are deep under the weight of sin that piles up generation upon generation. Pressed into the ground, we wait for the Lord. Our souls wait, and in God's word we hope. Our souls wait for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning.
The doctrine of discovery grew out of a theology of dominance over land, people, and resources. We lament the wasteful, greedy, and polluting ways of colonialism and proclaim the Creator's intentions for us to have right, balanced, and interdependent relationship with the earth.
Most people think of Cheyenne as nomadic and warlike, existing off the buffalo on the plains. Indeed, that was so, but for a brief period of our history. And incidentally, we, along with many tribes on the plains, were eventually subdued by a strategy that eliminated thousands of buffalo. When we were uprooted as a horticultural village people, we were forced to exist on the buffalo. We learned to respect this animal, and we took only as we needed, and we used all of it. The meat was dried and preserved. The hide was used for clothing, bedding, and shelter. Some of the bones were used for tools. In the slaughter of the buffalo by the thousands by white settlers, only the tongue and hide was taken from the animal. The carcasses were left to rot. Lawrence Hart.
I work with indigenous peoples in Suriname, South America, who face illness, death, displacement due to gold mining and other economic development projects in their traditional lands. The government provides concessions to mining companies that pollute indigenous territories with mercury and cyanide, even receiving foreign aid to do this. As economic interests have pushed them out of their traditional lands, indigenous peoples become refugees in their own country, fleeing violence imposed by private militias that are controlled by mining interests and concession holders. The Wayana have no legal recourse that will provide them protection from the financial interests that continue to extract resources from and destroy Wayana territories. Suriname courts do not recognize the rights of the Wayana to own or control their own lands because of the principles of discovery. European Christian states alone had the legal right to own land and the resources there during the times of colonization. Laws and policies justified by Christian doctrine formed the legal precedent for national and international policies that govern land use in the Americas to this day. Sarah Augustine.
Sustaining God, you are the creator of this world's abundance. You named this abundance good and intended it for all peoples. We confess that at times we have been afraid that we would not have enough, or that we would not be safe unless we secured the land, resources, and power for ourselves. We confess that our churches have been part of systems that sucks the lifeblood from indigenous communities, leaving them with few options for survival. And we confess that our churches continue to benefit from laws and policies that deny indigenous peoples' rights and lay waste to the land.
Out of the depths we cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear our voice. We are deep under the weight of sin that piles up generation upon generation. Pressed into the ground, we wait for the Lord. Our souls wait, and in God's word we hope. Our souls wait for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning.
We are still alive, she said. We really do exist. When people listen to our story, they can no longer claim to not know. That makes you accountable. Erica Littlewolf.
Now when I pray in Cheyenne. I pray in Indian because I feel that God gave me the Cheyenne language to speak, to converse with him. I always say, he gave me the Cheyenne language, and I feel free when I pray in my Cheyenne language. I feel that it's coming from my heart. I pray from my heart. I don't have to think what I'm going to say. It just naturally comes out because it's from my heart. I love this Mennonite church, and I've worked in it. One time they had this big meeting, a big conference with people from all over the world there, and I went. And they had me up on this platform so I could see. And they took all those people, all different colors, and they asked them to stand up and walk around. And I watched them, all colors of people, and it was so beautiful. And I said into the microphone to everyone, "How beautiful is God's creation? Why can't we get along?" Bertha Little Coyote.
What would it be like if our church institutions stood in solidarity with us? What might we accomplish if we approached the Human Rights Commission, the banks, and corporations as a united church? Sarah Augustine.
My hope for the Mennonite church is that it not lose its Anabaptist roots and human values, which is what makes it unique and puts it in a position to reach across cultures and nations for service and nonviolence. The world needs an alternative ethic, alternative to hatreds born out of implicable leftist and right-wing ideologies. I also hope that the Mennonite community will not forget on whose land they stand, that they will seek to understand and to support indigenous peoples' struggle for justice, land, and resource restitution. Emma LaRoque.
O my people, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with God is great power to redeem. It is God who will redeem us from all iniquities, who show us the way of justice and peace. Our souls wait for the Lord, more than those who watch for the morning. I would like to invite us to take a few moments of silence to reflect on what we've heard. Amen.
To pray, you open your whole self. To sky, to earth, to sun, to moon. To one whole voice that is you. And know there is more. That you can't see, can't hear, can't know except in moments. Steadily growing and in languages that aren't always sound but other. Circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning. Over salt river, circled in blue sky. And wind swept our hearts clean. With sacred wings, we see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning. Inside us, we pray that it will be done in beauty. In beauty.